On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broke the silence in a radio communication where he asked the Japanese people to endure the unendurable, Japan's unconditional surrender. What made Hirohito prefer peace, even though he had remained silent, or worse, had been complicit with Japanese militarism during Japan's 14 years of aggression? The natural answer is the devastating impact of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, respectively. This analysis is unambiguous and ignores the decisive factor: the entry of the USSR into the war on August 9, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima and a few hours before Nagasaki. The Red Army's sweeping invasion of Manchuria and the largest offensive of World War II jeopardized Japan's plans for an honorable surrender. To shed light on Japan's complex surrender, we must look at a few facts. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet leader reaffirmed his plans. The USSR would confront Japan 3 months after the end of operations in Europe, giving the Red Army enough time to mobilize troops in Manchuria. In April, when the Nazi army was on the verge of absolute meltdown, Stalin broke the non-aggression pact signed with Japan in 1941. In May, Stalin began transferring to the Far East the military corps that had defeated Germany. In 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, US President Harry Truman told Stalin that the atomic bomb was ready and that they would use it against Japan. But the president did not believe the bomb would end the war and asked the USSR to enter the conflict as soon as possible. Stalin agreed, as he did not want to be left out of the division of the Far East either. By early August 1945, the Red Army was ready. Within 3 months, more than 1.5 million soldiers had crossed Siberia and massed on the border of Manchukuo, a puppet state created by the Japanese military in 1932. Never had the Red Army gathered so many resources. By then, Japanese power was but a shadow of the past. The archipelago was isolated. However, they have one remaining asset, Manchuria, a rich region that had been conquered from China. This territory was outside the radius of American bombers and therefore free from attack. The archipelago could be invaded, many lives would be lost, but Japan would remain neutral in the war thanks to Manchuria's raw materials. Even with the USSR entering the conflict, the Japanese objective was to weaken them, not to fight them, as they were trying to do with the Americans in the Pacific. Japan did not intend to defeat its opponent, but to make it retreat due to an unsustainable number of human losses. Against this backdrop, on August 9, 1945, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the Red Army began the offensive. The Japanese tried to block the Red Army's advance, or at least to slow it down, but they failed miserably. With no weapons against the strong Soviet tanks, the soldiers threw themselves against the tracks of the armored vehicles, carrying mines or dynamite charges in their bodies. These sacrifices were futile, and the Japanese army collapsed. Manchuria was quickly conquered by the Soviets. This loss was a disaster for Japan, as the Red Army was able to join the archipelago invasion that the Americans had planned for the spring of 1946. Politically, it was also a major setback. With Stalin's intervention, the honorable peace desired by Japan was lost. Stalin was seen by the Japanese as an heir to the Tsarist Empire, in other words, a dangerous rival in the contest for hegemony in Northeast Asia. This dispute had begun with the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and continued throughout the first half of the 20th century. By early 1945, it was clear that Japan would not be able to sustain the American momentum, but Japanese endurance remained stubborn. The Battle of Okinawa was clear proof. It took 82 days of grueling fighting between April and June 1945 for the Americans to emerge victorious on this southern island. The balance of the conquest was bloody, 14,000 dead and 50,000 wounded among the Allies. These heavy losses prompted the United States to move on to an even more brutal stage in the air war against Japan, the atomic bomb. But American forces did not believe that this weapon would prevent troops from being deployed, fearing a campaign with many human losses on their side. Tokyo refused to surrender. Even after the bombing of Hiroshima, Japan's top brass did not meet until 3 days later, leading one to believe that surrender was not an urgent matter. The Japanese elite was deeply divided. The court internalized the idea that the war was lost, and the circle close to the emperor wanted to sacrifice the empire gained since the end of the 19th century to ensure the crown's salvation. The court's priority was to preserve Kokutai, the mystical religious organization embodied by the emperor and the ultimate justification of the entire political system. But what was the population's opinion? Well, the people increasingly disapproved of the sovereign. The signs were obvious, in demonstrations that accused the emperor of being responsible for the disasters that struck the country. It was necessary to end the war to save Hirohito. But the conflict was not to end by any means. The emperor would not commit suicide, like Hitler, nor would he be lynched, murdered, and paraded in a public square, like Mussolini. On the other hand, the military still believed that Japan was invincible, as it retained part of China and all of Manchuria. Nevertheless, a ceasefire would be possible under 4 conditions. First, the preservation of the monarchy. Second, the Allies could not intervene in Japanese demobilization. Third, Japan could not be occupied by the Allies. Fourth, officers accused of war crimes were to be tried by Japanese military courts. Japan's maritime geography and Manchuria hampered the US blockade. Even if attacked with atomic bombs, the empire could remain active in the war longer, causing the deaths of thousands of civilians and military personnel. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria was a relief to Washington and a terror to Tokyo. American strategists felt that the Soviets' entry into the war had a greater effect than the 2 atomic bombs. We know little about the reactions in the Imperial Palace to Hiroshima's destruction, the Soviet maelstrom, and Nagasaki's bombing. But these 3 events in a short space of time gave Hirohito's close circle convincing arguments to demand that the military lay down its arms. Saving the throne required reinventing its ruler. From a bellicose military leader unconcerned with his subjects' fate, Hirohito was transformed during these decisive days into a benevolent pacifist, a captive of a group of extremists. After a day's hesitation, Hirohito ordered the keeper of the imperial seal and the closest advisor to draft a decree to end the war. The final text was submitted on the evening of August 14, 1945, to Hirohito, who read it over the radio the next day at noon. In the text, USSR's invasion is mentioned subtly, while the atomic bomb was explicitly named. Hirohito said, "In order to save human civilization from complete extinction, Japan surrenders, even though that word was not pronounced." In the end, Japan surrendered on the terms it wanted. According to Bruno Biroli's essay, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was one of the decisive factors for the emperor to accept the surrender. If he didn't, he would lose his crown, and Japan could have been occupied militarily, ending up divided between the USSR and the United States, as had happened with Germany. For the United States, Japan's surrender was the best possible outcome. It allowed them to avoid another 2 years of war, save over 1 million lives, test atomic bombs on 2 cities, and, on top of that, keep Japan away from Soviet influence. But why do we keep talking so much about the atomic bombs, with barely a mention of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria? Well, even before the end of the conflict, the history of World War II was already being rewritten. The week after the surrender, the Prime Minister admitted in Parliament that the USSR's declaration of war had put the country in the worst possible situation. At the same time, the head of the transitional government revived the myth that the atomic bomb was the sole cause of Japan's defeat. It was to save Japan and its people from these horrific nukes that Hirohito ordered the weapons to be laid down, all in the interests of peace and humanity. Over the years, this narrative grew stronger. However, downplaying the USSR's role was also politically driven. Acknowledging the merits of the Red Army would mean ascribing to the Russians a stake in rearranging Japanese society. The Cold War arrived earlier in Asia than in Europe, sparking a military clash in China and then in Korea. Emphasizing the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and absolving Hirohito was essential to turn Japan into the backbone of the American defense system. And so it was.